I managed to get an A star in biology at A level. However, it was by no means easy, and I'd confidently say that it was probably one of my hardest A levels out of the four that I did. Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, my name's Jackery and I'm a student studying in London. And in this video, I just want to break down a few things I did that I feel helped me get an A star in biology and that can hopefully help you as well achieve the highest grade possible. Just for reference, I did biology, chemistry, maths and psychology plus an EPQ at A level, and I managed to get an A star in all of my subjects. If you've also done any of those subjects I've talked about, then definitely check my channel out, as I'm trying my best to make a video on every single one of them. At the time of recording this, I've already released the psychology video and the maths video should also be up by now, and hopefully if you're watching this sometime in the future, then the chemistry and EPQ video are both already up. But if they're not, then don't worry, I'll do my best to get them out. If you don't do any of those subjects but you still want some advice on how to approach A levels and how you can get the best grades possible, then definitely check out the video I made on how I got 5 A stars. That video goes into some general tips on how to approach A levels and isn't as subject specific. Just for reference, I did Edexcel Biology B. However, I don't feel like anything I talk about in this video is truly exclusive to my exam board only. As usual, timestamps will be in the description below so you can jump around and find exactly what you're looking for without wasting any time. Now firstly, before I get into the kind of tips, I do just want to say that if you are someone doing biology, don't be disheartened if you've done your first few mock exams and they haven't come back as well as you've wanted to. I managed to get an A star like I said, and when I came into A levels I'd gotten a grade 9 at GCSE biology, but even then I was doing really badly in my first few mocks, and I just want to say that that's perfectly normal. The subject is very difficult and the mark schemes are unlike anything you've probably seen before, so it's only natural that when you first start off, and this applies to any subject, that you don't really do as well as you think you can. If I'd have let that stop me, then I wouldn't have gone on to do as well as I did. So I just want to say that it's perfectly normal, and you shouldn't feel like if you're not getting an A star from the get-go that you totally have no chance of getting an A star whatsoever. Now, tip number 1 is to use a revision method that I think is called blurting. Now this is a revision method that I came across near GCSE time through Unjaded Jade. I'll leave a link to that video in the description below, but it's also something that my biology teacher started to recommend to all of us when we started A level. Now essentially, just to very briefly tell you what blurting is, you basically choose a chapter from your textbook or a topic. Typically what I like to do is I like to choose just a single chapter or a single spread from the textbook so that I didn't have to revise too much information at once. And what you basically do is you write down everything about that chapter or topic on a piece of paper, and typically what I'd recommend is you do it under timed conditions, not because it emulates an exam or whatnot, but more so just so you don't waste too much time on each blurt. Essentially, you write down everything you know about the topic, all the small details from the textbook that you've hopefully memorized, and then after you've done that, what you then do is you open up the textbook or whatever resources you use, and you just go in with a different color pen and you correct all the kind of mistakes that you made. And then what you do moving forward is, for your revision, you then focus on those little areas that you got wrong just a little bit more. Now you see, with this method, along with the majority of revision methods that I recommend, it's a very active form of revision. It's not a simple case of just reading the textbook, but more so actively recalling the textbook as best as you can. It's definitely a bit more of a challenge, and sometimes it can be difficult when you've just gone through a chapter, but I think you'll find that blurting is a really good method for subjects like biology, which are quite content heavy, and it's sometimes difficult to find specific questions on everything in the textbook even though you want to test yourself actively. This isn't something I did religiously, but every so often I found myself doing a blur. I do it on my iPad, but at the start of year 12 I started doing it on paper. I hopefully still have some copies of my blurts that I'll put on the screen, both the digital versions and the paper versions, so you can kind of get a rough idea. They don't have to be neat, they don't have to be pretty. The whole point is just to get all the information down on the paper to force yourself to actively recall everything on the chapter. Now tip number 2 is kind of going to be how I approached most of the content. Now I did something similar for the A-level maths video where I talked about how I approach new content, and I feel like it will be useful to put in this video as well. Similarly to what I mentioned in that video, the way I'd kind of approach new content is I'd try my best to firstly pay as much attention in class and listen to what my teacher has to say. I feel like if you can try your best to pay attention in class and try your best to understand the content, then what that will mean is once you come home, you'll definitely have a lot less work you have to manage. After I'd do that, I'd come home and then I'd watch some videos on the topic. Now, a really good source to watch videos is obviously on YouTube. You can find a lot of bite-sized videos, maybe 5 to 10 minutes. However, another resource that I used that I found really useful was a resource called SnapProvise. Now, unfortunately, this isn't free, but I definitely think that it helped me a lot in understanding the content. Now, essentially what SnapProvise does is that it takes the whole course. So like I said, I did Edexcel Biology B. It will take that whole course and just split up into different chapters and then split out further into kind of sub chapters and just make very short bite-sized videos on the chapter that was specific to the exam board. Now, I found those really easy to digest, really easy to watch, and they were quite colorful and nice, so they were less boring than some of the videos I found on YouTube. I found that those were perfect in helping me very quickly just jog my memory on the content and fill in any gaps. And since they were quite colorful and illustrative, sometimes I would literally take screenshots from the videos and kind of turn them into flashcards, especially with content that was very diagram heavy. And that brings me on to the next step. Like I said, once I've understood the content confidently and I feel like I can comprehend what everything means, I will then move on to making Anki flashcards. Now, Anki was kind of like a central element of most of my revision, but you don't necessarily have to use Anki. The whole concept of it is that using Anki let me do active revision and let me question myself. Once I've made my flashcards on the topic or chapter that I've gone through, I then make sure that I actually made time to go through those flashcards so that I could actually commit them to memory. There's no use making all the flashcards in the world but then not going through them all, so this was definitely high on my priority list. Along with this, like I mentioned in the previous tip, I would also do some blurting from time to time, especially in instances where I've either gone through my flashcards or maybe there was a certain topic that I haven't gone through in a while that I haven't really seen Anki give me any flashcards on, and I just want to really quickly revisit that chapter to make sure that I'm on top of it and I know it really well. And then after that period of kind of revising the content after understanding it, I would then move on to doing past paper exam practice questions. I feel like there's nothing out there that will prepare you as well for the exams as the actual past paper questions and specific exam questions, and so I'd always make sure that in my revision I'd incorporate time to work on those. Now, in subjects like biology, doing past paper questions are especially important. I'd say even more so than other subjects, and I'm going to go into why a bit later on, but just understand that you really want to make sure you're doing past questions as soon as you feel confident in your understanding of the content. Tip number 3 is relating to the answers you put down in the exam, and that's to be conscious of keywords, the phrasing of your answer, and especially how specific you are when writing down an answer. And this is kind of why I put so much emphasis on doing past paper questions, especially for biology, because understanding things like the certain keywords that the exam board want you to put is something that you can only truly get a grasp of once you've exposed yourself to enough exam questions. Something that was really frustrating for me about biology was that you could have a perfect understanding of a content and everything you put down in the exam could be technically correct and also relevant to the question. However, you won't get all the marks, and in some cases you don't get any marks, which was very frustrating for me. But the reality is that the exam mark schemes in biology are so hyper specific that even missing out a single keyword could be enough to not get you the mark. Like I said, it's frustrating because there's a lot of times where your biology teacher might mark one of your answers and they'll tell you that they completely understand what you're trying to say, but they can't give you the marks because it's not as specific as the mark scheme want, or you've missed out 1 or 2 keywords. The sooner you learn how microscopic the mark schemes can be in biology, the sooner you'll be able to work around that and try and get as many marks as you can. It's instances like that where the mark schemes can really catch you out. If you're someone who's done biology or are doing biology, then you know for sure that this type of scenario comes up a lot, where you've mentioned something but you haven't gotten the mark because you've not been specific enough, or you think you've been specific enough but then you've missed out 1 or 2 keywords. Other examples could be commonly what I would do as a mistake is I would describe keywords or concepts without actually naming said keyword or concept. So for example, in an answer that's talking about osmosis, I could say that there's movement of water from an area of high water concentration to an area of low water concentration, but I lose out on the mark simply because I haven't mentioned the word osmosis. Trust me when I say that biology mark schemes are genuinely like this. Now, once you've identified these keywords or certain phrases that the mark scheme want you to include, in instances like that, what I then recommend is you open up your flashcard app or even your physical notes or flashcards, and you just very quickly update what you've written down to include what the mark schemes say, just so when you're revising the content over and over, you're actually internalizing the specific response that the mark team want rather than maybe a more generic response. Tip number 4 is a really quick one. It kind of builds on everything I've just said in the last few tips, and that it's very crucial that you mark your work properly. A lot of people, when they do practice questions, they put all the emphasis on answering the questions, and yes, that is the important part. That's actually the active recall part of the revision technique of doing practice questions. However, if you don't put enough effort into marking your work or correcting any mistakes, then what you'll find is that come the exam time, you'll forget all the mistakes that you made. I personally would always write down my answers and then go in again with a different color pen and just open up the mark scheme and physically write down all the mistakes I made. I found that by doing that, it made the actual revision task more engaging, and it also increased the likelihood of me remembering the mistake I made, because if I ever saw a similar question in the exam, I would not only remember answering it, but I'd also remember marking it more vividly. And if I can remember marking it, then I can remember maybe some of the specific keywords the mark scheme was looking for, or specific phrasing, which, like I said in the last bit of advice, can be crucial in whether or not you get the marks. I know a lot of people are kind of not bothered to mark it, and sometimes what they might do is they might answer the question and just look at the mark scheme and mentally mark it. But I highly recommend that you actually write down all your self-assessment, because it will help you remember it. And if you ever look back at the exam questions, you can save yourself a lot of time by focusing on the marking that you did rather than what you wrote in the answer. And by focusing on the actual corrections you made, then what you'll do is you'll be recapping the part that you were weakest at the last time you did the question, which is more useful than just recapping everything. So I would always mark my answers in a green pen. So sometimes what I do is, if I've ever done some exam questions and I was looking back at them, I'd kind of focus on reading what I wrote in the green pen section, because typically that's what I struggled with, and I'd rather focus on my areas of weakness than my areas of strength. Tip number 5 is to look out for reoccurring questions when you're doing practice questions. Now, I know you're probably realizing a really clear theme in this video, and that's that there's a huge focus on exam practice and exam questions, but the reality is that that is a crucial part of A-level biology, and it's kind of hard for me to move away from that since it plays such a big role in your revision. But essentially, look out for reoccurring questions. In some topics or chapters, there are just certain questions that keep on coming up no matter what, and it's very hard for the examiners to kind of change up the question or the wording, so they just end up putting it as it is every time it comes up. You might see variations of a certain question, but when you boil it down to the skeleton of it, it's typically the same thing over and over again. If I had to think from the top of my head now, I don't have any examples at hand, but certain questions that definitely came up a lot were questions like, what are some structural differences between bacteria and viruses? Now, this is just from the top of my head, but I remember when I was revising that question would just always come up. Like, while I was doing practice questions, it would just constantly come up. No matter which question bank I was using, I just always see it in the exam paper. And another thing I noticed was that the mark schemes every time were basically the same thing. It got to the point where it was so repetitive that I just thought, why don't I just take that question and commit the mark scheme to memory? And that way, when that question comes up, I won't have to think. I'll just regurgitate what I've already memorized, because I clearly understand it. I've clearly seen it enough times. What's the point of struggling to figure it out when I can just memorize the mark scheme and save myself a lot of time? I would also typically turn these questions into Anki flashcards, especially if it was a shorter 2 or 3 mark questions, and it would just save me a lot of time in the long run. It's also quite a nice feeling when you've done a lot of exam practice and you've made note of some reoccurring questions that keep coming up, and then you actually see those questions either in your actual exam or any mock exams that you do. It's really nice when you look at that question and you just know that you're guaranteed to get all the marks from that question, simply because you've revised really well and you were very smart about how you revised. You were able to see the repetitive question and commit it to memory, which is fair play to you. You gain the extra marks and it makes it a lot easier. In a subject that catches so many people out because of the mark schemes, there's nothing wrong with using that to your advantage and just memorizing the mark scheme for certain questions. Now the next tip is regarding how you should go about using past paper questions, but more specifically past exam papers. Now what I would recommend is you avoid doing past exam papers. Now when I say avoid doing past exam papers, I don't mean avoid doing past exam questions. What I mean is try not to go through actual full exam papers at the start of your course or when you're not confident enough on the majority of the content. Past papers should always be done under time condition because they can give you a representation of how you would do in an actual exam doing the full paper from start to finish. However, if you go into past exam papers prematurely before you've understood enough of the content or before you've even gone through all the content necessary, then you're just wasting the past paper, because eventually you're going to come across a question on content that you haven't gone through and you won't be able to answer it, not because you haven't revised enough, but because you haven't gone through it at all, and there's nothing you can do about that. So you don't want to waste those exam papers when you're not ready. Now typically with any exam board, there are multiple exams. So for me, we had 3 exam papers for the actual Edexcel Biology B course, and each exam paper typically has a list of topics it goes through. So what you can do is you can look at that list, and once you feel like you've confidently gone through all that content, then you can attempt the exam papers. And typically what this will mean is that you can't really use the exam papers to their full potential until a bit later on in the year. In the first few terms, you really shouldn't be touching full exam papers because you'll just be wasting them. An alternative for this is, obviously it's very hard to go through all the content, but what you can also do is you can look at AS papers. Now obviously AS papers are a little easier than A-level papers. The good thing about AS papers is they typically contain fewer topics per paper, and so you can start to attempt those a little earlier on in the year once you've gone through those specific chapters. Obviously at the start of the year you'll probably want to definitely be doing exam questions, and so what I would do is I would go on a website called Physics and Maths Tutor. Now hopefully in the description of this video there will be multiple links to useful YouTube channels and question banks, but Physics and Maths Tutor is quite a common one, and it's one I would use where after doing a topic and, like I said, going through my Anki cards and making them and whatnot, I would do the topic specific questions on Physics and Maths Tutor. Now what's really nice about that website is they split everything up into separate sub chapters, so it's very easy for you to do isolated question practice and not have to kind of be faced with questions on chapters you haven't covered. Try not to do the exam papers too early, instead do chapter or topic specific exam questions, and PMT is a perfect way to do that. Now the final tip is to understand how content can interlink in biology and use that to your advantage. When you notice interlinking between 2 chapters, then what that can do is, 1, it can make learning the new content a lot easier because it's less unfamiliar to you, and 2, it can help you with understanding. It's much easier when you have something to compare the content to or link the content to, rather than when you're learning a completely new concept from scratch and you don't have any reference points whatsoever. What interlinking would also do is it would help me derive the content if ever I was a bit unsure about it or kind of forgot it. If I would do a chapter and I couldn't remember it completely, but I knew it was closely linked to another chapter, I would try and bring in that knowledge to kind of fill in any gaps that I have, either during my revision or, more importantly, during the actual exam if I was a bit unsure. Now it might be difficult to see interlinking between chapters, but I feel like for the most part it can be quite clear. An example I can give you is in the textbooks that I used. In chapter 2 of the first year book, it's all about cells and viruses, but later on in the second year book there's a chapter on pathogens and viruses and infection pathways, etc. And what I found was when I was going through that chapter, it really closely linked to the viruses chapter in the first book, or the viruses component. And I found that because I'd revised that properly and I had a good understanding of all that content, when I went through that new chapter, because it was so similar in many different aspects, I began interlinking the content, and memorizing the newer content and understanding it became a lot easier. Now, interlinking chapters is something you can do for a lot of subjects, but I find for sciences it's a very useful skill, especially for biology. It's also why teachers typically tell you to pay so much attention in year 1, because a lot of the time the newer chapters that come up in year 2 are kind of like variations of the first year content. So definitely try and interlink the chapters and see where that gets you. And with that, we have reached the end of the video. So if you enjoyed the video or found it useful, then leave a like, subscribe, and let me know what you thought in the comments below. I talked about quite a few things, but even then there could have been 1 or 2 things that I either didn't go into enough detail about or maybe completely missed. So if you have a question about anything, feel free to ask below and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. Like I said, biology is a difficult subject, but hopefully with all these tips and advice, it'll become more manageable and you'll kind of have a bit more of an approach to how you tackle the content. Thank you so much if you made it this far. That's been all from me, and goodbye.